The talk is entitled Ningyo, the Unexpected World of Japanese Dolls, just because I find that so many people have fairly narrow definitions of both what a doll is and then also a lot of preconceived notions about Japanese dolls. Most people are familiar with souvenir dolls that came back from the war, geisha in glass boxes. So many people know about geishas in glass boxes, and then some play dolls people are familiar with. But I have been dealing with Japanese dolls, Ningyo, since 1993. And I am nowhere near the end of the rainbow in terms of following all the different permutations and variations and sub-themes. And so what I'd like to do today is to sort of go through some of those and in the process possibly challenge assumptions, expectations about what a doll is, and maybe elasticize thought a little bit about the whole thing. So periodically I'll come back and say, what is a doll? Because I'll be showing you something and you go, I don't think so. Typically, I love this photograph, and if anyone knows who this lady is, please let me know. A photograph I found, I actually purchased it. It's from the 1950s in Pittsburgh or Baltimore. But I love this thing because all these baby dolls, this may be a concept of collecting, what you collect, but collectors have their own passions. Collectors have the things that they zero in on. And for each of us, our definition of what is the epitome of a doll is going to be different. So again, what actually is a doll? And this is, I don't know, it's French, possibly. Valerie Fogel shared it with me. This is not my area of expertise, but for many, this might be considered the epitome of what a doll is. Now, in contradistinction, we're going to hang a sharp left. You keep this image in mind and compare it to this. Now, this is a Japanese doll. This doll is arguably 10,000 years old. So when you're dealing with Japanese culture, you're looking at dolls that have been woven into the very fabric of society for literally millennia. And dolls universally have factored their way into different societies, both primitive and sophisticated, for millennia. But what makes Japan different, and I think unique in the world, is that they have maintained a continuous emphasis on Japanese doll for arguably 13,000 years, with many permutations and developments along the way. And we're not going to go through 13,000 years of history. I'm sure you're all breathing a sigh of relief. But at the same time, it is important to contextualize a little bit, because we use the word doll, but in Japan, they use the word ningyo. Ningyo means human figure. And so right off the bat, we're dealing with something a little bit larger, something a little bit more embracive than our word doll. So, for example, continuing over, or jumping up to the 7th century, they had materials called hitogata. Hitogata were scapegoat dolls that were used to absorb malevolent influences. They were burned, they would be buried, they would be kept in the home, all as a way to be protective in a talismanic way. In excavations around cities, they found entire trenches filled with thousands and thousands of hitogata that they believe were buried to protect from a plague or to dispel a plague. So from the very beginning, Ningyo have had a quasi, you don't want to say religious, but a quasi talismanic, quasi-spiritual component to them that lies just beneath the surface. Almost any doll form we're looking at, if you just scratch a little bit, you're going to hit something a little bit larger than play. Dolls have been ritually destroyed, ritually sent out to sea in purification moves from the beginning. Dolls have been used and placed by a child's bedstead in order to protect the child from diseases and malevolent influences. And so here you have a Ningyo tableau of a baby being watched over by his or her mother. And then next you'll see a T-shaped object called an amagatsu, and that was supposed to protect the child through infancy, but they were kept all the way through for the woman to adulthood and taken to her marriage home. For boys, it was destroyed when they had their coming of age ceremony, roughly around the age 16. But these dolls, these talismanic dolls for children, the T-shaped Amaterasu, frequently also had a companion doll, more feminine, softer. This sort of tubular shaped doll is called a hoko. And this was seen as more of a feminine doll made from scraps. The T-shaped doll has a bamboo underlay, silk from the home would be wrapped around it, and literally the child's clothing would have been placed on the doll to create a bond between the child and the doll. The hoko, it literally means crawling baby, would just been scraps of silk stitched together, hair put on it as a talismanic figure. But these form the bedrock for what figures you might be a little bit more familiar with for the Hina Matsuri, for the Girls' Day display. The Emperor and Empress in earlier iterations were made out of paper and or paper with applied textiles in that T-shaped and cylindrical shape. So if you do a comparison between the Amaterasu and the Hoko here, you'll see clearly the overlay in this nascent form, these early forms of the Girls' Day display. But from there, but remember, at core, they still have a protective aspect. They still have a protective kind of component going on. But now, rather than protecting the child at its bedside, it is protecting the home. It is protecting a larger swath. Over time, these got much more sophisticated. From the standing simple forms, they became more seated forms. Entire economies, and I mean robust economies, evolved around the Girls' Day and doll selling. And so this is a scroll from the early 1800s that depict one of the main streets in Nihonbashi section in Tokyo, Edo, Tokyo. And in the middle there with the red cloth, those are temporary stalls selling dolls for the Hina Matsuri. So this represents the third month market where they were selling dolls for that. But what this also talks about is the commercialism that existed side by side with the spirituality of the religiosity, and that a lot of money, a lot of artistry were invested in the creation of these dolls and the display of these dolls. So for example, in the mid-1700s, you have the evolution of this form. These, my friends, are 33 inches high seated, right? So 33 inches high seated it's taken up a lot of real estate. And these would have been exhibited in the home, displayed in the home during that Girls' Day display for a very short period of time. This was the focus. This was the nexus of the whole display, because it was believed during this period of time, spirits came down and inhabited these dolls. And by keeping them happy, they in turn blessed the home, protected the home for the year. So they play this beautiful display element role, this display role, but they also have a propitiatory or a talismanic component. As I said, just beneath the surface, that is true to this day. I'm not talking, these dolls are from the 1750s, but the exact same principles are in play today, even with dolls that depict Barbie and Ken. You see Hina Matsuri Girls' Day dolls depicting Barbie and Ken, contemporary characters, but they're fulfilling the same role. And over time, many different forms evolved, artistry evolved, but beneath that is that. And I think all of us will agree that these are accepted as doll figures. I don't think anyone who saw this in a store would get, I'm not sure what that is. They would know it's a doll. They may not know all the details. But, and then today, people are very familiar with this sort of tiered setup, 15 dolls total. But what is important to remember that the top tier has the imperial couple, the Daidibina. Beneath them, the various attendants, musicians, ministers, their only purpose for existing in display is to make the imperial couple happy, and in making them happy, they bless the home. So they play completely a supportive role to the imperial couple at top. But there are other festivals, other ways in which Ningyo were brought into the community, displayed and protected. These also, arguably, I think everyone would agree, are dolls, but this is for the Boys' Day display. That is on May 5th. So the Girls' Day was the third day of the third month. The Boys' Day is the fifth day of the fifth month. And rather than having this sort of elegant, stylized imperial court, they brought out the big guns, focusing on samurai and martial figures from Japanese history that were known for their daring do or their ferocity or their success as warriors. Because at this point, again, spirits come down and inhabit these dolls, but it's more of an aggressive thing. It's a more of a powerful component called a goryo. So these spirits have a lot more machismo and a lot more teeth to them than the third day, third month. But again, beautiful sculptures. This doll is 28 inches high seated, so also quite big. But in having this sort of scale, we can dial in on the details and just see how beautiful the sculpture is. Now, this is an important slide for a number of reasons. One, it just shows how beautiful the doll is, but quite frequently people who would look at this image, what material do you think that face is made of? Westerners, more familiar with porcelain dolls, looking at the sheen, looking at the white, would likely assume that it's porcelain, but it is not. Almost every single category of Ningyo that we're going to be looking at today and what you've seen thus far are made out of a material called a gofun, which is a crushed oyster shell and animal glue, works as a lacquer, works as a paste, and layer upon layer gets applied at certain times. In certain iterations, it can be sculpted, so the features around the nose, the philtrum above the lip, the chin shape, the eye shape, that's all carved and all crafted. But at the end of the day, the finer layers are very, very shiny and very, very thin and completely water soluble. So I always hasten to add that because they're water soluble, you cannot clean them the way you can clean a porcelain doll. You take a little bit of wet rag and you try and wipe off a smudge. You've stripped away literally centuries of gofun. So they're it's a beautiful material. It's arguably a very frustrating material, both for the artisans that work for it and for the collector. But ultimately, I think its beauty outweighs any of the more tedious elements of gofun. So when you see these dolls, you see the white faces and or the pigmented faces. That material is not porcelain. It is a material called gofun that's over a substrata of wood or wood composite. But heroes were brought out from history, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. So for me, part of the hook, part of the reason I find Japanese dolls in general so fascinating is that they serve as a very interesting and specific window into aspects of Japanese culture, history, customs, practices that we are not used to. So for me, it's endlessly fresh, endlessly interesting because there's always a new chapter to discover. Why a specific doll? I won't go into it today, but I could give an entire presentation on this doll alone. There's so many layers to this onion, but today we'll move on from that. But again, talking about the market element, look at this doll. How many artisans were involved? Not only do you have the doll with the gofun and the insect glass eyes and the hair, but you also had armor with real metalwork. You had leather workers. You had textile workers. You had papier-mâché elements. You had all these industries that evolved and developed to support the Ningyo making. So central and so important were Ningyo dolls to Japanese society on many different levels, and we're just beginning to get started. There was an entire radiating out element of supporting artisans and artisanal elements that help, make them, I think, entirely special and specific and so beautiful. Currently, I don't know, we're from all over the place. I have an exhibition on these warrior dolls going on at the Morikami Museum of Japanese Art down in Delray Beach, Florida. It's open until October 6th, so you can hop on a plane tomorrow and go down. It's an absolutely extraordinary exhibition, but diving deep into this one specific category, an entire exhibition just on that. So now we're going to move into something tangentially, on the surface, quite different, but also quite connected. Infant mortality in Japan, as in many, many cultures, was devastating, and they did everything they could to counteract it, from various traditional medicines to acupuncture to the whole raft of options. But one thing that they did that not many other cultures did was that they would look at dolls as a way to protect and help heal children of measles and smallpox. So here is a woodblock print from the late 1700s, and you have a child in bed, and you can see that there is space. He or she is afflicted with smallpox. But if you look at the foot, you'll see all these dolls arranged in front, and those are what are known as Hoso Ningyo, or smallpox dolls or measles dolls. They were designed specifically. They were made, created, purchased, and used specifically to protect children from smallpox or to help hasten the case along. And so this is, and after the child was healed or recovered and or died, the doll was then ritually burned. And so it's very rare that these dolls have survived. So Hoso Ningyo are an exceptionally rare category within the genre of Japanese dolls. And so this is a Hoso Ningyo. And one of the reasons why this is a Hoso Ningyo is the red color. Red was seen as a protective color. And red also, the measles and the smallpox, the pustules were frequently red. And this is a character drawn from Japanese folklore and legend called a shoujo. Shoujo were sake-loving imps from the sea who would drink copious amounts of sake. Their hair would turn red, their face would turn red. And that color red was seen as being very protective and talismanic. And so the shoujo, this drunken imp, was frequently used as a Hoso Ningyo. And so there's like, as I said, many layers to this onion. So there's the shoujo with her sake ladle and her sake cup already buzzed with a red face to protect the child from alcohol. Now, quite frequently, when I'm dealing with or speaking about Japanese dolls, I seem to stray quite a bit away from children. Warriors and imperial couples and this, that, and the other seems a far cry from the day-to-day life of children and or depicting children. Well, there's an interesting category of doll, of Ningyo called a Gosho Ningyo, and that is a palace doll. And palace dolls originated within the imperial court. They were gift dolls given by the emperor to visiting daimyo, or imperial noble or samurai nobles that would come. They would present to the court a list of all the gifts that they brought. In exchange for receiving that list of gifts, the emperor would bequeath to them or give to them a gosho doll or palace doll depicting a young boy about the age of 3. And you go, well, that's very specific and that's very odd. Well, in Japanese primogeniture-driven society, the male heir was everything. It connoted longevity. It connoted So the thing that everyone wanted more than anything in the world was a healthy boy. And so these cherubic, fat, corpulent young boys represented this ultimate wish of having a male heir and a boy. And so they in themselves were seen as auspicious gifts. And quite frequently they would be paired with symbols. So like a Gosho Ningyo holding a money mallet would represent a wish for good, for money or wealth. Holding a giant fish would be for daily provision. This doll in front of you now is actually depicting Momotaro, the peach boy, and would have been, again, to display martial valor, wish for martial valor for the young children of the daimyo. It started within the imperial circles. It was a very, very narrow range, but over time it expanded out, and it actually became a very robust commercial enterprise, separated completely from the imperial context. But the meaning, the idea of giving a Gosho Ningyo, a fat, chubby boy, as a gift remains true to this day, as it is seen as an auspicious and valued gift. And there are a certain number of artisans working in that genre today. As you go down the various rabbit holes, as I do, this is actually a famous Gosho Ningyo that was in a French collection. The doll's name is Mikika, and paintings were done of this doll. Poetry was made of this doll. It was a cause célèbre in Paris in the 1880s. Jules Adeline was the owner. Jules Adeline was a successful artist, etcher, and this was in his private collection. And so this Gosho Ningyo crossed the seas and became sort of a famous individual in Parisian society, although he was based in Rouen. Adeline was based in Rouen. He frequented the salons in Paris, and Mikika, as Adeline named him, was a very famous doll, sadly now lost to us. We have wonderful documents of him, poetry, paintings, but we don't have Mikika no more. As I mentioned before, the tradition continues today, but it's sort of stretching the envelope and making them a little bit more artistic, a little bit more fun. This is depicting Moso, one of the paragons of filial piety. I won't go into that right now, because again, I could do a whole talk just on this doll. So I want to hang a left, a very, very sharp left. We've largely been talking about dolls in the domestic space, but dolls also played a very important, visible, and significant role in the public space, specifically in the theater. And in the late 1600s, early 1700s, you have the emergence on the scene in Osaka of an entire theater developed around the display of mechanical dolls. This was known as the Takeda-za. None of those dolls are extant, but we have many, many, many woodblock prints just depicting the doll and then also describing what the dolls could do. These were mechanical dolls, karakuri, and we'll spend a little bit of time on this. But it's interesting because they were, if the records are to believe, quite sophisticated. So this particular doll of a monk, a Buddhist monk riding a fox, would have started up on the stand in the back, and it would have the crank would have been turned, and then the fox with the doll on its back would have hopped off and run around the stage, moved around the stage. Now, in the woodblock print, it looks very lifelike and whatnot. I'm sure the movements were fairly simplistic, but late 1600s, this was jaw-dropping entertainment, and the Takeda Theater was an empire, very, very important cultural force. Some of the dolls were a little bit off color. So you see the top doll is being coaxed by an attendant. And then as he moves, he opens up his kimono and he pees into a bowl. He urinates into a bowl. How fun, how interesting. But it was, back in the day, this was a very popular form of entertainment. And as I said, Takeda became an economic force for many, many, many years until the theater burned down and then the family dispersed, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But what this does is just the tip of the iceberg of many, many different forms of puppetry and mechanized dolls that had not necessarily as wide a sway of influence as Takeda did. But as you travel around the country in Japan and go to backwaters, you'll frequently find ingenious and indigenous localized forms of mechanical dolls. So these dolls actually were an early conveyor belt system and water-powered conveyor belt, and the dolls would move along tracks, and you can see at the bottom there are various levers, and it's kind of like an early computer system. As it moved along the track, there'd be different togs that would trip a lever, and the head would turn, the hand would go up. And by carefully mapping out this conveyor belt and placing these pegs to trigger the mechanisms, they told entire stories using dolls in this. And this particular form evolved in the early 1800s in more northern Japan. I mentioned the Takeda family. When it broke up, it divided up into, because of fire and because of, well, corruption, and they were convicted of graft, they were convicted of not paying taxes, and the whole thing in Osaka came tumbling down. But the family dispersed. One branch of the family moved to Edo, Tokyo, where they continued to do small-scale mechanical dolls, but they also developed a specialty in dolls called Takeda Ningyo, Takeda from the same family, but depicting kabuki actors and scenes from the kabuki stage. So this is an entire genre, souvenir doll for the kabuki stage, still based from the Takeda family. The other branch of the Takeda focused in Nagoya, where they made large-scale dolls for festival floats that were mechanized. So this depicts a famous scene of the young warrior Ushiwaka Maru confronting Benkei, the warrior monk Benkei. And I can't do the whole thing, but this one festival card, the doll jumps across a series of posts and battles Benkei, being controlled underneath by sort of like a reverse marionette. Part of it is automated, part of it is very complicated strings working from underneath. And this is a very, very famous component of Japanese culture, doll culture, called karakuri. And so this shows you a little bit of the internal workings, where various strings would lift the hands, lift the arms, and in the hands of a master, these dolls literally came to life. And to this day, these dolls, these festival floats featuring mechanical dolls are the highlight of many, many, many annual festivals that run the entire length of the archipelago. And again, the West has a little bit of this. Other countries in Asia, I think of Indonesia, has a little bit of this, but Japan's the only one that has all of this, and in spades, and going to a level of artistry that just can't beat. retracing back a little bit, focusing on katakuri, but going back into the domestic sort of milieu. This is a woodblock print, again, from the 1700s that shows the domestic scene. And if you look carefully in the front, you'll see dolls on stands and how everyone is just so thoroughly delighted with whatever is happening. Well, what is going on? Well, these are what are known as zashiki katakuri or parlor katakuri. So when you look at this doll, if you look at the lower right, its proper left, but our lower right, you'll see a handle. Well, when you turn that handle, there's sort of a tinny kind of music that plays, and the doll here holds a fan. And I don't know if you can see, those are actually butterflies on wires behind its back. And the doll slowly pivots and bends over while the music plays and the butterflies spin around. And that was it. It was a simple entertainment, but wildly successful and popular, although also wildly expensive. So it was restrictive to the upper echelons of society. So I want to go back to that print and zero in a little bit. And if you look, you'll see a doll that's holding a teacup, which is very, very interesting because this is not static. This is a full-fledged automaton, so that when the crank is, the crank is turned and a full cup of tea is placed in the hands of the tray. The hands, of course, go down with the weight, and that triggers an internal mechanism that has the doll move across the room a specific distance to the guest. The guest picks up the cup of tea. That triggers an internal mechanism to stop the movement. The customer or the guest drinks the tea, puts the empty cup back on the hands. That tells the doll that activates the springs again. The doll turns around and goes back to the host. So early automation, but not being employed to manufacture cars or make life better, employed just for a giggle and a laugh. And so one wonders to think if they had applied all this technology to a little bit more, they could have had trains earlier, they could have had all sorts of stuff. But a lot of energy and emphasis was placed on making these whimsies because they were so popular, and then also a money-making endeavor. Now, another realm of theater that I want to focus on a little bit is the Bunraku Theater. This is a wonderful screen that's in the Sackler Museum, although I don't think we want to say Sackler anymore, at the Smithsonian, that shows an early puppet performance. And you'll see that the puppeteers are holding the puppet from underneath. But over time, these puppets became more and more sophisticated to where each puppet required 3 individuals to operate. So in this picture, you'll see an individual without a mask. That is the lead puppeteer. He's controlling the head and the proper right arm. He directs movement. He's the sort of the lead focus character, hence he's the one without the mask. You'll see a hooded figure immediately to his proper left. That is the secondary actor or performer, and that is holding up the body and controlling the left arm. These two have to work in tandem to form a seamless movement. But in addition, there is a third actor down below. If you notice, there's a bare hand holding the left foot of that male figure. So in order to operate one puppet, it took 3 actors. Now imagine on a stage where you had 8 puppets, 10 puppets, 12 puppets. You know, do the math. You have 36 actors on stage that have to move around, follow what's going on, and then make the audience forget that they are there at all. And this is done through staging, this is done through scenes, but more importantly, it is done through the incredible skill sets that these puppeteers had, the Bunraku puppet masters had, to make these dolls come to life. Now, from a Ningyo perspective, from an artisanal standpoint, the heads, or the kashira, are the most important. And over time, as more and more plays were written and this is another thing, I'm sorry, I'm stopping myself. In terms of classical Japanese literature, more of the classics were actually written for the puppet stage than for any other form of theater. So that tells you that how important and how elevated and how honored Bunraku puppetry was within Japanese traditional culture. More people will be possibly familiar with kabuki. Kabuki frequently stole verbatim the playwrights and the chants and the narratives that were written for the bunraku stage, and then adapted them to the kabuki stage. And then frequently there was cross-fertilization. The kabuki would make a development, and that would be brought back into bunraku, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, sort of a ping pong game. But bunraku still remains a national treasure centered in Osaka. The artistry and the techniques that were employed are quite interesting. So here you have a mechanized doll, again called karakuri, a maiden by day, but by night a demon. So these dolls frequently had transformative elements built in, whether that be like this, a full transformation from female beauty to female demon, to eyebrows lifting, mouths opening. So there were a lot of mechanical elements that went to the doll to add to the narrative. Of course, we have amazing textiles that were placed. So imagine the stage where these actors move back and forth, but the light glistening on these amazing, amazing kimono, which of course all would have been by lamplight and candlelight back in the day. Warriors, just the entire gamut of Japanese history and narrative and literature, tragedies, Shakespearean with puppets. It's just even beyond. But also an interesting thing to keep photo, I showed you a couple of images where the dolls had moved, but the vast majority of the doll heads are in a fixed expression. But it is up to the puppeteer to make that one fixed expression be alternatively joyful, sad, pensive, angry, outraged, demure, aggressive. Same face, all of those. And that is from the tilting and the play of the puppeteer. Now, moving into a different category, but still theatrically based, is a material or a type of doll called an iki ningyo, or a living doll. And so these are hyper-realistically rendered life-size figures that were displayed temporarily in something like a Madame Tussauds wax kind of museum kind of idea. But these are all made out of wood, covered in gofun, and then equipped with textiles, and these different vignettes would be set up, and people would pay to come see them. Matsumoto Kisaburo was the preeminent and basically the inventor of the form. It was seeing his dolls that the term iki ningyo were coined, and as you can see, very lifelike, very, very complete. This doll set is actually in the Smithsonian Institute, and one of the few signed dolls by Kisaburo in existence. It's in the Smithsonian. This is a 8-foot doll, 8-foot tall tableau depicting two sumo wrestlers. This was originally purchased in Japan and brought over, and was in the Detroit Institute of the Arts back in the late 1800s, and remained there until the 1990s when they deaccessioned it. Detroit at that point was going through a lot of financial woes. And so they decided to deaccession some of their figures. And I actually had an opportunity to buy this piece, but it's a very difficult sell. You know, who wants an 8-foot tall wrestling pair in their living room? But it ultimately went back to a museum in Kumamoto, where it is to this day. But again, you can see the power and how they would have a draw for audience to come in and see and view. This is another iki ningyo pair, which I find fascinating. This is actually an archival Meiji era photograph, a famous photograph, but most of the people who collected them, who published this photograph, said that it was two kabuki actors. But in point of fact, these are two dolls. These are two hyper-realistic iki ningyo. The reason that the photograph garnered a lot of attention was because of that shadowy image located between the two of them, this ghost image, if you will. And people tended to overlook, assuming that these were human, but they're not. Once you know the things to look for, this is clearly an iki ningyo. If you look at her palms, you can see the very fat crease beneath the thumb. That is frequently a sort of short term you find that in iki ningyo. If you go back to the image, the first image, if you look at her feet, they are straightforward, just immediately straightforward, not naturalistic at all. Certainly not for a kabuki performer who would have been grace incarnate. So these are two iki ningyos that for many, many, many generations fooled people who looked at this thinking that they were actually actors. Now, my favorite doll of all time is Hananuma Masakichi. Hananuma Masakichi was made in Japan, but purchased again by an American, brought over to San Francisco. So this is actually a cabinet card from San Francisco when Hananu Masakichi was on display. He traveled around all over California, where he was known at that time, somewhat affectionately, but still offensively, as the Jap. Traveled to Los Angeles, but you can see the skill sets. This is carved wood covered in gofun, done in the 1800s. Now, Hananu Masakichi is still around today. Hananu Masakichi was purchased by Ripley when he first saw it in the 1950s, and Ripley being Ripley, he created a very, very interesting sort of narrative around this doll. The narrative is that Hananu Masakichi, the artist, was in love, but he was dying of tuberculosis. And so he was in love, and he wanted to create an image of himself to leave with his beloved after he passed. So he created this image in every bit as real as him, to the point where he supposedly ripped out his fingernails and used his real fingernails. He ripped out his hair and used his real hair, ripped out his teeth and used his real teeth, and then would pose next to the photograph and next to the doll, and no one could tell the difference. Well, obviously, if he ripped out his teeth, ripped out his fingernails, and ripped out his hair, people are going to know the difference. But in point of fact, it's the doll. It's the doll pictured clothed. It's the doll pictured in a loincloth. But Ripley worked this angle for decades. And even today, the story, if you Google Masakichi, he has a cult following online because people believe the story to this day, thinking that this is Hananu Masakichi's portrait of himself using real body parts, but not. Hananu Masakichi was part of a trade making hyper-realistic dolls for the export market. And this is the shop of Kun and Kumar in Yokohama. And if you look carefully, you'll see that there are Ningyo peppered around in this. And so this would have been Hananu Masakichi's natural habitat. He would have made more small-scale dolls for export. The big figure that Ripley bought just happened to be a very, very big one that was purchased by an American and still traveling around the world. Now, ending up in this thing, again, this is another early Meiji print. I've used this image over and over and over. I was delighted of a fisherman wrestling a squid. I was delighted, however, to find that this showed up at auction in Paris not that long ago. So the doll still exists, and which I find fascinating. So this allows you to see it's not life-size. It would have been more for the export market, so slightly smaller. But look at the detail. Look at this giant squid, the tentacles wrapping around. Absolutely amazing. But then I asked that question, what is a doll? Is this a doll? In Japanese context, it's certainly a ningyo, but for us, it blurs the line. Is it sculpture? What is it? And so this is a thing that has made Japanese ningyo a head-scratching affair for the Western art world. How do we respond? What are we supposed to think of these figures? Now, after this, however many minutes I'm in, you're thinking, well, didn't they make dolls for children? Yes, they did. And there's an entire genre that evolved around this. And then I did a book on these, so I'll talk about it briefly at the end. But this is Princess Nori at her first birthday. So she's a full year old, but actually doing the Japanese calendar, she's technically more of a 2-year-old. But at her first seku, she was gifted a doll. And this is the formal imperial portrait of Princess Nori for her first seku. But what I love about it is the doll is there, obviously just placed. But at her next birthday, she's photographed again with the same doll. And then at her next birthday, she's photographed with the same doll. So this Ichimatsu, this doll in the background, clearly served the same function that dolls that the West frequently relates to, a beloved companion for a child. Yes, they had them in spades. And took them to artistic levels and to levels that I think that Jumeau and whatever rarely could achieve. But again, this material is gofun. All this is the same material, completely water soluble, completely fugitive, but oh so beautiful, oh so elegant, but very, Japanese. So briefly, I'll dial back a little bit. Ichimatsu is the name of this doll, but it comes from a kabuki acting lineage. Sanagawa Ichimatsu. So if you look at the middle slide, the female figure at the bottom that has the checkerboard pattern, that is the actor Sanagawa Ichimatsu, who specialized in both male roles as well as beautiful feminine roles. And he set the world on fire when one day he came out wearing this checkerboard obi and he set off a fashion craze. And so Ichimatsu means checkerboard, became synonymous with the actor, and that is why the name of the doll is to this day, and I'll do a little bit of a development of that. Dolls depicting actors were a very common, popular souvenir dolls. Earlier, we saw the kabuki thing made by Takeda, but that tradition dates from the 1800s. We have tradition going back to the early 1700s, where popular actors had dolls would be made of popular actors in a role. Few of those dolls survive, but we have abundant woodblock print imagery. So this is a beautiful woman holding up a doll depicting the actor Sanagawa Ichimatsu, and you know that by the crest that's on his sleeve. Sanagawa was the original heartthrob for both men and women. People collected his prints. People bought dolls of him so that they could change his clothing. And so this is a female figure, and you would think, okay, no connection to this. But if we really dial in and look at it, you'll notice that checkerboard element in there. So this is arguably Sanagawa Ichimatsu in a female role. And this would have been a doll that would have been purchased to commemorate Sanagawa Ichimatsu, or commemorating the fashion craze that he set off, because that checkerboard pattern became all the rage in the 1700s. So, but structurally, because people wanted to change clothing on the doll, artists couldn't be dolls couldn't be static. They had to be articulated in various ways. And so this is a woodblock print showing different forms of articulation. The middle one is fairly basic. It just has padded upper arms. By having the padded wire upper arms, the arms could be bent so a kimono could be slid on. The figure to the far left, far more sophisticated. You have a joint at the hip, you have a joint at the knee, and you have a joint at the ankle. And that is what is known as mitsuore, triple jointed. So that doll could be positioned kneeling, that doll could be positioned standing, that doll could be positioned seated. And that allowed buyers of the doll to play with them, to change clothing, position the dolls, much in the way that we interact with a BJD or that kind of doll today, where the intent, the design was to be manipulated and played with and dress and change clothes. So they were frequently sold naked or hadaka, and then people would either make or buy clothing, frequently make them, and then be able to dress and redress their own dolls. And so this is an extant example, and you can see the articulation in the hip, the knee, the ankle, but this has additional articulation in the wrist, which was a later development in the first half of the 1900s. And then further even along, you had an additional joint called a koshi ore. So you can see that at the beginning of at the very top of well, start at the bottom, the ankles are jointed, going back and forth only. Then you have the knee joint. Then you have at the upper thigh, the very top of the thigh, you can see where it joins the hip. But now it has an added, above the pelvis, an added joint, so that doll could be situated down and balanced quite correctly. And that's her clothed a rear view to show a little bit how elegant the kimono was, and that the hair at the back. And again, a little bit of the articulation of the wrist. One of the more popular iterations of these mitsuore dolls for changing clothes was also changing wigs. And you have doll sets up to 36 and possibly more, but the largest one I've ever saw is with 36 wigs. And by changing the wig and changing the costuming, the doll could be a different age, it could be a different profession, and an infinite fascinating study. Just the wigs themselves, again, it would have been a special artisanal group of people who focused on the wigs, but the doll is an articulated doll, and it's already depicted kneeling, and that is how they would have been pressed into play. Different artisanal groups and artists specialized in mitsuore, or this triple jointed doll. This is by Tokusai, the supplier to the imperial family. This is an amazing set by him that was actually, this is a tinted photograph from a book that was published in 1936. Originally, there was supposed to be a World Doll exhibition held in Amsterdam, but because of the drumbeats of war, the Japanese did not participate, and so they did a commemorative book. And I have loved and slathered and licked this photograph over and over because I just think that they are so beautiful. But recently, or relatively recently now, I actually found an archival photograph of what the dolls look like and just quite extraordinary. So they are about 36 inches high in size, so bigger than a friendship doll, but they are also Mitsuore, triple jointed construction. We don't know where they are today. They belong to one of the branches of the imperial family based out of Wakayama, but we don't know where these dolls are today. But absolutely extraordinary, again, showing. Now, one could argue that these aren't really for play. They would have been dressed, but at 36 inches, they weren't frequently having those clothes changed, and they moved more into a presentation mode. But with play, and now this is going to segue a little bit into Western dolls, is the evolution in the mid-1800s of a doll called a daki ningyo, or a huggable doll. The body construction, oh, this is, oh my God, I just love this figure. So wonderful. The Gofun face, the eyes, inset glass, just, I love him. But body construction wise, this is important. So he has a soft middle, soft upper thighs, padded arms. And so this doll could not stand on its own. It would just fall down. And it was designed to be held. By design, it should be held. And now you can see how that articulation in the wrist, imagine the doll is being held, and it looks, and so you reach forward and you touch the hand like you would do a baby, and the hand moves. It responds in gesture. So that articulation added to its sense of verisimilitude. But the structure of the daki ningyo evolving in the mid-19th century is the direct precursor of a doll that you may be more familiar with, and that would be the Sonnenberg Toffling or the Moxman type doll. That was a direct ripoff, literally copyright infringement of the Japanese daki ningyo, but made a little bit more to Western taste. The feet articulation, the articulation of the wrist, the legs. I don't have a good body shot of the mechanism of a Sonnenberg Toffling, but structurally that is what it is, minus the large penis. So daki ningyo were designed to simulate children, very, very young children, infants, and they were proportionally or accordingly frequently baby size. So this is a photograph of an infant dressed up for that hakuseko, that first seku photograph. But this would have been a daki ningyo done in that sort of guise. Here, his head goes back and forth and his tongue points in and out. The wrists are articulated. Now, it was very, very common practice for women, and so these weren't designed for children. They depict children, but they were designed for adults, frequently women who had either lost their children or who no longer had children at home. It was socially acceptable for them to be seen in public with their doll and treated in every way as if it was a living child. And that was for a very brief period of time, a decade or two, a very popular trend within the Meiji era. And so dolls evolved to do this, being more lifelike and being more reflective of an actual child. Artisanal lineages focused on this. So this is another daki ningyo pair. And again, the artistry is really quite wonderful and special, but done by the salon of Ito Hisashige. And so this is the shop label of Ito Hisashige. And that's a very specific label. You can see it's a kneeling boy there. Well, Ito Hisashige got its start as a doll making lineage. They were originally in another trade, but as they moved into a doll making lineage, they created this specific doll at the outset of a giant measles epidemic or smallpox outbreak in Kyoto. And they placed this doll on their outside of their shop on a platform. And it was said that no one in the neighborhood came down with measles or were afflicted with smallpox. So this doll became quite famous in Kyoto. And for many years, I didn't know it existed, but I had the opportunity to, and also backtrack, the imperial family got word of this doll, came and visited the doll, and bequeathed upon Ito Hisashige the right to make dolls for the imperial family, right that they maintain to this day. This is actually the current Ito Hisashige, number 12. So 12th generation Ito Hisashige. And so I visited his gallery or his studio back in December, met him for the first time. and asked him to please tell me the story of this doll. I knew the story, but I wanted to hear it because that often brings out other elements, additional elements that I may not know. So this is a photograph from the 1960s of the doll on the front outside of the shop. Now, literally, it was for generations the wife's responsibility every morning to bring the doll out and put it in this specific spot, rain or shine. And it was her responsibility at the close of business day to bring the doll inside. It was her job. She could not be away from home. She had to do this in the morning and in the evening. And Ito Hisashige's wife was there, and she nodded in affirmation that for much of her married life, when the shop was still open, her job every single morning was to take this doll and put it outside, and every evening to bring it back inside. There's even a famous or a woodblock print that shows this doll on the stoop. The shop sadly closed, and but the doll is happily conserved there at Ito Hisashige's studio. And so it was very, very wonderful to meet. But again, I'm hoping that I'm coming to the end fairly shortly here, that you're beginning to get a glimpse that the role of Ningyo, the role of the doll in Japanese culture is so much more vast than ours, our limited sense of doll. Over the course, like Ito Shige, certain artisans became famous and sort of put their imprimatur on Ichimatsu as they developed as a form. Actually, I'm jumping 2 steps ahead. Ichimatsu are structurally different. They don't have articulated wrists. They don't have articulated ankles. They're much more static that way, but still soft body construction. And so once Daki Ningyo, that huggable doll, fell out of favor toward the end of the 1800s, into the 19th century, Ichimatsu evolved structurally, but by the superior work of art. Again, I love this doll. She's about 28 inches high, super beautiful, a male figure. So again, just the artisanal skills that were brought to bear in the development of this form. This is by Takeuchi. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little tongue-tied here. Masujiro. Takeuchi Masujiro, very famous artist in the late 1800s, early 1900s. He put his imprimatur on the female figure, but while the artist Toko put his imprimatur on the female figure. So they basically set the look, the Okapa bangs, having the doll, again, slightly older. The Daki Ningyo, if you remember, was an infant, a child to be held. This is more of a young boy and girl of ages 5 or 7. So that was a huge transition from Daki Ningyo up. But that set the stage to the Ichimatsu that many of you will be familiar with today. Absolutely extraordinary, the range of skills and tastes and what they look at. Frequently, people look at them and they say, well, they all look the same, which is, I feel like I want to just scream when that happens, but I had a mea culpa. This is an auction catalog from Terrialts, showing what they refer to as a bevy of beauties, featuring dolls by Emile Jumeau, Jules Steiner, Rabbery and Delfieux, Montereau Gaultier. Folks, to me, they all look alike. Each one of these look alike. That's only because I don't know. I don't know a Jumeau from a Gaultier. I mean, I'm sure everyone in the room or everyone in the Zoom call is going, well, he's an idiot. Of course you can pick that out. Well, no, I'm just not educated. So part of my lot in life has been to help educate people into the idiosyncrasies and the idiosyncratic beauty of Japanese dolls, and how each and every doll is hand carved. Each and every doll, by definition, even though there's a mold at the base, all the elements of the gofun are carved, hand done. So it's impossible for any two to be exactly alike. They all have personalities. And as you dive in, just a casual glance, even though basically you have basically the same haircut, you basically have overall the same Japanese features, but they are all individuals, and their individuality shines through in the hand of an artist, a skilled artist. And so it goes on and on and on and on and on. Hirata Goyo is arguably the most famous and most skilled Ichimatsu Ningyo maker that ever lived. And so his dolls command a high premium, but you can see they are the stuff of stories and legend, just beautiful faces that you can spot a Goyo, a mile away. Just beautiful. Here you have actual eyelashes, pouty face, just really extraordinary. In his lineage, not in Ichimatsu, not necessarily a pretty face, but his lineage went on to basically command Japanese doll art making from the beginning of his participation in the Friendship Dolls of 1927 through to his passing in the 1980s, branching out into what are known as Shosaku Ningyo, or art dolls. This is by his younger brother Yoko. Just a whole sort of downstream element of Japanese doll making. Now, to round this up, finish off, doll making is still an important part of Japanese culture today. I introduced you to the 12th generation Ito Hisashige a few minutes ago. This is Fujimura Kokan. He is a current maker living today, and arguably, to my mind, he has the greatest skill set of any living. His aesthetic is a little bit different than mine, but the skills that he brings in terms of his use of textiles, his working of gofun, I find to be just sans pareil. He is a doll maker of note that I support actively, and hopefully he will actually be at the UFDC next year. We're trying to get him into convention next year, so you'll be able to meet him in person. And those who have gone on my tours have met him. So just to finish up, just a few images. I'm not going to talk much about these, just beautiful dolls, but again, very, very different from what we are used to aesthetically on so many levels. And again, I just never get tired of Ningyo and the different levels and layers of artistry and moods that they are able to capture and depict. I just find them to be, 30 some odd years later, I'm still smitten and sodded and all of that. I've written a couple of books on the topic, and they're all available on my website. The most recent is this one on Ichimatsu, which won 2 bronze medals in the Independent Publishers Award. I'm pretty proud of that because it was for a fine art book. So here's a Japanese doll book winning an award for best art book in the Independent Publishers Award. And if any of you are interested in going deeper, further, I have YouTube videos galore that explore many different aspects of Japanese dolls. And then also I lead tours to Japan. My next one is November 1st through the 13th. It's sold out. A few of you I know have been on my tours and hopefully give it not a negative feedback. But I continue to do these every other year. So this one's sold out. My next tour will be in spring of 2026. And if those of you who are interested, I have a waiting list already forming. I try and keep it to 15 people only, and it tends to sell out. So if you are interested, please let me know and I'll put you on the list. And that's it. So sayonara, that's the end of my presentation.